I made a video on trans athletics, and I did a pretty damn poor job of it. One of the things I've learned from being excommunicated is I think that the religious mindset is everywhere, and it's really hard to get rid of. And I'm not even sure if getting rid of it's a good idea. Something that was sold is that religion is the problem. It's not. Is the problem. What I'm tired of is people pretending that these complex topics are simple. They're not. You know, when people start complaining about, that film's woke, I think that's actually partly in the legacy of New Atheism. If I have to be in the middle of New Atheism and Old Atheism, or whatever it might be, hell, call me a medieval atheist, just like that. It was like a religious experience.
Say you did die and it turns out there is a God, what would you say?
It's a good question.
Hi, Justin here. Before we begin, would you like a free chapter of my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God? I'll send it to you when you join my newsletter. Go to justinbrierley.com or click the link in the info. Enjoy today's show.
It's lovely to be joined now by Stephen Woodford, aka Rationality Rules. He has a hugely popular YouTube channel of that name, and he's joined me to talk about his own journey as a YouTube atheist, and just whereabouts the movement is these days. So thank you very much for chatting to me, Stephen.
It's always a pleasure, Justin, and thank you for having me.
Well, tell me a bit about how you got into all this. I mean, I see you and many of your generation as kind of pioneers, really, of YouTube vlogging and that kind of thing. You specifically sort of have become known for someone who, you know, aims to debunk what you see as fallacious arguments, especially around religion and so on. Where did that all begin for you to start with?
From the age of reason, if you will. So when I was growing up, I was very interested in the big questions, as are so many other people. And I asked those questions to the authoritative people in my community, which tended to be of a Christian ilk. I went to a religious school, for instance, and so I was able to ask questions that now I know were pertaining to the problem of evil, but then were just questions. And I wasn't satisfied with some of the answers, so I ended up looking up more and more and more, and then I found myself on the presence of the internet. And of course, with the wave of new atheism, with the likes of Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and the debates and the topics that were happening on YouTube that were very entertaining and very, I thought, enlightening at the time, but of course not so much. It was more of a entertainment enterprise rather than, say, a scholarly one. But that led me to end up looking up some of the scholars, you know, say Alex Proust or William Lane Craig, and just a deep interest in why are we here? What's our purpose? Well, my culture is Christian, and it says that we're here because of a story that relates to Jesus. So I was just very interested in it all and came at it with a bit of fire, if you will. So that's how I got into the YouTube sphere, and I haven't left it since.
No, and you've made a very successful go of it. Did you have any sort of Christian upbringing or influence yourself, or would you say you've always sort of been a non-believer as far as you can remember?
So I had a very turbulent upbringing. I went through unofficial foster care, so I didn't have the stability of anything, let alone a specific religion. But Christianity was certainly in the background, if you will. Some of the people that very kindly looked after me, they were Christian. There's plenty of people that were secular. There's some people that were not. There were different religions. The school was religious that I went to. So I had a background which wasn't specifically Christian, but like a mix. And I would say that because I had a struggling upbringing, I was thinking very early on about the problem of evil. I was thinking, for instance, what did I do wrong in order to receive this physical and mental abuse? Like, what did I do something wrong in my last life? Because some people that believe in reincarnation would issue that actually is a proposition and it would account for the data. Now I was thinking, okay, well, how does the Christian deal with this kind of issue? And then, of course, you start looking at theodicies. I would say that about the age of maybe 11 or 12, I managed to get my head around evolution by natural selection. And just like that, it was like a religious experience, is the way I would describe it. Just so much of the world made sense to me, and I would say from then on, I certainly would have qualified as a lack-theist, that kind of definition of an atheist. As for becoming, someone who actively believes that there are no gods, that took some time, because you've got to consider epistemology, ontology, various different considerations across different fields. But I think it would be probably unfair to say that I've ever been a Christian.
Sure, that's fine. And to that extent, what kind of motivated your interest, or creating a channel that essentially debunked religion? I don't get the sense you had an axe to grind necessarily against Christianity. Sometimes there is a motivation for people who've been hurt by religious upbringings and that kind of thing. I don't get the sense that particularly that was a motivation for you. What was driving this desire to kind of critique and debunk religious arguments and so on?
I think it was twofold. So on the one hand, I was embodying something that I would later find out was championed by Galileo. If there is a God, he created me with a mind and didn't intend for me to forego its use. So I wanted to use my mind, and I felt like a lot of people were just not doing that in the religious sphere. For instance, pretty much everyone that was rejecting evolution is religious, and they're fighting hard for it. They don't want it in schools, at least at the time. And this was a huge, this has made religion a problem, or at least it's made these variations of religion, these variations of Christianity a problem, and I want to fight against it because I care about truth, God or no God. It's, he's going to want us to know what the truth is. So I was fighting for those reasons. But then as I started opening myself out to those discussions, I found that when it came to basically every single movement for social rights, be it the emancipation of, by my light, slavery, be it homosexual rights, be it women and their place as a first-class citizen in society, I found that religion was just always on the wrong end of it. And what I mean by that is that the bulk of the religious people were on the wrong end. But by the time we had went through a process of, as a culture moving forward, then Christians would start claiming that, oh, no, it's because of us that actually we have this great movement forward. And so I found that I kept grinding my axe against people that were essentially being homophobic or transphobic or something like that. And it just so happens that it was pretty much always going to be a religious person, because that's what was justifying their disposition. So that's how I fell into that pattern, if that makes sense.
Okay. The new atheism, what do you understand that term to mean, and how would you define it?
New atheism is such an interesting phenomenon, and it's something that has very much, in my early life, it defined me. Like, I've never felt closer to someone I've never met than I do with Christopher Hitchens. I wept when he died, and some of the words that he gave still resonate with me. For example, he said, take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more truth, beauty and wisdom will come to you that way. I think of that daily. I think it's such an important message. Of course, he's not the first to express it, but he did it in a powerful way that was relevant to me when I was a teenager. Now, as for what New Atheism was and what it was trying to achieve, there's various assessments that you can have, but my assessment is it was the precipice of people saying enough with the religious and clerical bullying, as Christopher would have put it. We're done with living our lives according to what we consider to be fantasy. This isn't good enough. You can have your religion, but you're going to have it separate from throwing it into schools or forcing me to live according to your religion. Enough, done. And part of being able to achieve that required, by my lights, mockery. It required a much more fierce tone. And so that's what you saw broadly, especially with Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and a bit of Sam Harris. Daniel Dennett was always quite soft, and some of the other names, you've got a variety of how they approach the topic. But I think it was a political movement to essentially separate state institutions from religious institutions, at least in practice, even if it's not on paper. So that's how I see the movement.
And obviously, as you say, the movement did deal in ridicule to some extent. give us some examples of what you were seeing happening. Did you essentially approve? Did you take part yourself, in a sense, in that kind of more a mockery of religious belief?
Yeah. So at first, I definitely would have fallen into this category of mocking religious people. So one of the things that was being expressed is that, Christians are believing in, resurrections, in faith healing. If you're a Catholic, you believe that the wafer turns into Jesus's body, etc. And one of the mockeries that came across was that Christians are mentally ill, like genuinely mentally ill. And I have to admit, rather embarrassingly, that at a point, I would have considered that a fair assessment of the situation. I don't anymore, but that would be an example of where I think, the mockery was there, and by my lights, it went too far. So yes, there was plenty of situations like that where it was pretty ferocious and unfair to religious people.
Why did you change your mind on that then? Why? And I don't know, did you see a change in the new atheists as well on that front?
So why did I change my mind? I have always been interested in truth. And so if you take the hypothesis that just loads of people in your society are mentally ill, that's quite a costly proposition to buy. It's like, would evolution by natural selection really select in such a way as to have so many people be mentally ill? I don't think so. And if it's true that God exists, would it be the case that those that most believe in him, can operate on these levels of delusion? I don't think so. I think that's quite a costly proposition to buy. So maybe there's something else going on here. And then as I started studying more and more, I started learning about rational disagreement on certain epistemic situations, and that if you disagree at the foundation, it's going to have wild effects on the kind of things that you're going to believe in when it comes to the surface level. So that's one reason why I started changing my mind. And then, again, evolution by natural selection made me realize there's something much more powerful going on here. To give you a succinct rendition of what I'm getting at here, in the Garden of Eden, it's a snake. It's a snake that's personified as the devil. It's a snake that's personified as evil. On the surface, a talking snake, what do you want about? This is absolutely ridiculous. However, if you consider the fact that we are an evolved primate, and that for a very long time, one of our arch enemies was the snake, it's, you get bit, especially when you're young, you're dead. It's a really serious threat. And also, they're just the complete opposite of humans. We're a social species. That's what, by my lights, morality is. It's social software. Whereas a snake is a solitary species, and it's a deadly predator, and it will kill you, and it probably can't be reasoned with because it's not evolved to reason. It's not a social creature. So when you start looking at the stories and the myths you could do it with Greek mythology, but of course you can also do it with Abrahamic mythology. The stories are not just random. There is something true about them. There's something that latches on to our evolutionary psyche that we're going to understand internally and through intuition way before we understand what's actually going on in terms of why we have those thoughts. And so I think that a lot of religious people are just wired different to me. Blaise Pascal spoke of how some people are so made as not to believe. I am that person. I don't have whatever this religious bone in the body is. For whatever reason, God's made me, if he exists, in such a way as not to have this bone. Maybe I'm just, I don't know what's going on, but I don't have it. But I do recognize that a lot of people do, and their intuitions are very powerful when they lock onto these evolutionary psychological elements, which are embodied very much in these stories that you find in the Bible and in other mythos.
To that extent, are you less interested these days in kind of arguing people out of their beliefs? Do you think that's misguided?
I see. It's quite interesting. It's if someone is being, say, homophobic, what I want to try and do is stop them from being homophobic, because by my lights, it's just harmful. What I would used to do is I would go, right, why are they being homophobic? Okay, they're referencing the Bible. They've got lots of verses that are telling them that, being a homosexual is wrong. So on the one hand, I could try and undercut their Christianity. I could try and get it so that they no longer adhere to Abrahamic faith. That's a really big task. You're going to have to go right to the foundations, and you are never going to achieve this in a conversation. So as times went on, I've actually found that you're better off appealing to the propositions that people believe in and showing that their conclusions don't necessarily follow from what they already accept. So, for instance, you can speak to that person and say, look, a lot of Christians do not think that being gay is wrong. Let's look at the way that they justify it, and let's see how your intuitions play with that. And I found that you can have some good ground to make some good progress with people by doing that. And it's not just with Christianity. I'll do this across the board. So it depends on the topic that I'm debating. Basically, religion was a cauldron for me to learn how to have what is hopefully a healthy balance between a good conversation and an entertaining conversation. And because I've learned that in religion, I apply it to other domains of discourse. But yeah, I've definitely changed in my pursuit and the way that I address these things.
And would you say that, you know, the content of your channel now is a bit broader than just the sort of debunking religious claims?
Yeah, for certain. I think that the content on my channel has grown as I've grown. And that's not to say that I think that the old content is done and dusted and should be left alone. Rather, I think that a lot of people, when they go through their process of growing, they need that kind of content. That is the kind of content that's going to shake them from their slumber. However, as you move on and you start asking further questions, you're going to need other types of content. And I'm in a bit of a hybrid. I've went from dealing with your everyday religious person, and because I live in England, it's normally Christianity, to dealing with the philosophers, William Lane Craig, Alex Proust, Peter van Inwagen, like you name it. Like I've went from what is the most popular variants, but actually pretty poor arguments, such as Frank Turek, Lee Strobel, to the very good arguments or the decent arguments, but no Christian really, that's not why they're a Christian kind of thing. And what I've learned over the period is that actually they're very different enterprises. They're completely different things. And by my lights, New Atheism is very much dealing with the first horn. It is not dealing with the second horn, and it was never meant to deal with the second horn, even though it did present itself in some situations as if it was. It wasn't.
That's really interesting to hear. Has the better arguments that you've engaged with moved the needle at all for you on the probability of whether God exists?
When I first started looking at the works of some theists, Josh Rasmussen was the one that came to mind, who does come to mind. My credence in God did go up, but then as I learned more and more and more, my credence has went down. When it comes to, say, a vague God, so the God isn't necessarily all-powerful or all-loving, but it's a deity, I'm going to have a set percentage, really, roughly, of where I think that might or might not be true, and that's changed over time. But the Christian view, which is to say, the Abrahamic view of an all-powerful, all-loving God, I think that the problem of evil is so powerful that I think that God has a near zero chance of existing. So I did end up getting closer to it, but I'm now further than I've ever been before, which is not something I expected. I did actually think that I would end up closer, but no, At least on my journey as I am right now, no, I'm about as far away from the Christian God as I could be.
So I'm hearing there that obviously you'd need some kind of really major defeater to the problem of evil for that to even sort of begin to be a possibility. But it sounds like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth here, that a kind of deistic kind of God, there's a little bit more kind of possibility of some arguments for that. I guess what I'm interested in is, can you imagine what it would take for you to believe that there is a God of some kind, not necessarily the Christian God, but or just some sort of divine sort of mind behind the universe, as it were? Would you know what that would look like to come to that belief?
Yeah, so when you say a divine mind, do you mean one of a supernatural state, or could it be a natural state?
Well, sketch out both possibilities for me. I'd be interested in hearing your distinction.
So because one of them is going to just be natural and the other one's going to be supernatural, it's just going to follow that the supernatural is going to have a higher burden to me than the natural, because I already believe in the natural world, and I think that pretty much everything that we want to explain around the world is done through naturalism. I don't see any need to buy supernaturalism. However, if it was a God that's supernatural, I'm going to have to get over the hurdle of actually thinking that there is a supernatural realm, and that is a really big ask. It's possible, but that will give you an idea of like the differences in where I would say that God has a chance of existing versus this God. And really, it's going to be a matter of understanding what someone means by God in order to assess what kind of probability or what it would take for me to believe in that God. You could define God as a powerful being, not all powerful, and a loving being, but not all loving. And in which case, you're essentially describing a very powerful, say, alien that may have created, a simulation of their world in order to try and harvest some ideas and whatnot. That's possible. As for how probable, I don't know, but I take that proposition quite seriously, because I think that when we get to a sufficient amount of control over our environment, we'll do the same. We'll set up little universes, if you will, simply because they might discover things that we haven't, and that's got utility. I don't see why an alien species wouldn't do that. And if you're willing to say that would count as a god, and I would be tempted to say it does, then
yeah, I can see how that could be
probability on that.
As close to a god as you could probably get. So you take quite seriously that sort of Nick Bostrom type hypothesis that we could be living in a kind of simulated universe from some higher technology.
The thing about that argument is that there isn't yes is the short answer. Yeah, I do think that it's a very interesting thought experiment or argument, and yeah, I do take it quite seriously. However, I would lean towards no, but I'm definitely agnostic on it. I think it's something really serious to consider, and I think it has a far higher chance of being true than, say, a supernatural God. But yeah, when it comes to the supernatural, it's going to depend on what kind of things you say that God's got. So, for instance, almost every theist I've ever spoken to thinks that morality exists and that morality is cashed out in terms of divine command theory. I think divine command theory is ridiculous. Like, it's not morality whatsoever. It's just might makes right. And I don't think that it can defeat the Euthyphro dilemma at all. So if you have a God that insists on divine command theory, that's a hell of a hurdle for you to jump over, or for me to be able to jump over to be convinced of, in order to think that God exists. And so it's a matter of different, one, how are you defining the God? What's entailed by the God? And then what kind of propositions do I need to buy in order to end up buying that God? So it's a very hard question to answer, if only because it's really hard to define what a God is. Another thing I'll quickly say on this is that if you take Christianity and you say, right, supernatural God, on the one hand, they've both got all of the same doctrines, but on the one hand, you've got annihilationism. That's what happens when you die if you're a non-believer. And then on the other hand, you've got universalism. I think universalism has a significantly higher chance of being true than annihilationism, even though I think that via the scripture, annihilationism is way better justified than universalism. And the reason for that is because I just think it's an insult to God to say that an all-powerful, all-loving God would create beings that get annihilated. That just doesn't seem...
You're right. That's interesting. Hi, Justin here. Hope you're enjoying the conversation. Just to say, if you want to support my work, you'll get early access to episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters even get signed copies of both my books and the chance for monthly catch-ups. The links are with the info. And now, back to where we left off. I mean, again, this is a very hypothetical question, but I'm always interested to hear, though, how people like Hitchens and Stephen Fry have answered it when they've been asked. But say you did die and it turns out there is a God and you kind of had a chance to say something to God, what would you say?
It's a good question. I think I would ask, God, why have you created a world that seems to so many people like me to not have your presence in? And if you're going to issue punishments and rewards based on this, please explain to me how on earth you're justifying that in terms of morality. Because neither of those propositions make any sense to me. As your child, please enlighten me before you send me into the darkness. At least give me my answer.
I think it's a very good question. I'm super tempted to go into debate mode, but I'm going to resist the temptation and just keep going with my questions because I really want to hear your views on coming back to the new atheism. We've heard a little bit about the way you've developed, in your own sort of perspective on God and how you engage these debates. What do you think happened to the new atheism itself? What's your analysis of where that movement went?
Well, I think actually what you've written in your book very largely tells the story, and that is that it started as a movement of telling people, listen, you've got your religion, but you're not going to make me be living according to your religion. Get out. But then as time went on, it progressed, and you had like somewhat of a split. Call it Catholicism and Protestantism, right? You had this split, and some of the atheists are just really considering, let's just have good conversations and have free speech and not worry about, whether or not we say things that hurt other people. That's the price of free speech. Whereas other parts of the atheist community very much was like, no, like this is a movement and an activist movement that cares about something, and it cares about X, Y, and Z, and X, Y, and Z tends to be social rights. So it will be something like women's rights or gay rights or trans rights. And so you've basically had this fracturing. Again, not unlike what happened with Christianity. You have this fracturing with different schools, they're broadly on the same page, but they have their own agendas and they have their own interests and their own goals and their own activism. So I think that it's split in that sense, but it's very much alive. It's actually got control, if you will, with a lot of society. When people start complaining about, that film's woke, I think that's actually partly in the legacy of new atheism.
Explain that a bit then, because if as a movement it's no longer got quite the same cultural sort of recognition or whatever, are you saying its effects have actually sort of, it's done its job almost? What do you mean by that?
So take Christianity as an analog. Christianity would have had like a solid message, kind of. Like if you look at the early church, actually, there was some really wild beliefs among some of the early church fathers, or at least what could be considered church fathers. But you have this split where there's all sorts of propositions that some Christians buy that the others don't. And really, if you just look at it, they're essentially different religions. Like these are some really different views that they have. Yet it's not right to say that Christianity failed. It didn't fail. It was incredibly successful. It's one of the most successful institutions, if you will, of all time. Certainly one of the most successful religions. And yet it is completely fractured. It's completely all over the place. I would say the same as happens with a lot of movements, and that is that when they get this successful revolution, they do split, and you do get disagreements, and you do get fighting, and even like wars. So, we had countless situations of Catholics and Protestants ripping each other's heads off. Doesn't mean that Christianity failed. If anything, they're both running on the fuel of Christianity. That's how they're justifying their acts. Likewise, you get atheist groups that hate each other, but they're still off the same foundation. So that's how I view atheism. It's essentially very similar to other movements like Christianity in terms of where it is now and what it's doing now. And you can feel the effects of it in films, in conversations, in you name it. It's all over the place. It's permeated our society so effectively that it's sometimes hard to even recognize that is Christian or that is new atheism. It's quite hard.
One of the arguments I make in the book, I don't know if you agree with this, is that I think those that went off in the kind of free thought, kind of more anti-woke direction of the new atheists, they almost replaced their critique of Christianity and Islam and religion with critique of what they would see as other forms of quasi-religious belief, i.e. transgender, identitarian concerns and so on. What do you think of that thesis?
So something else you mentioned in the book, forgive me if it's in the same chapter, But you mentioned about the religious mindset and whether or not you can get rid of the religious mindset. One of the things I've learned from being an activist, from being on the back end of being, excommunicated as well for saying things on transgender athletics, for instance, is I think that the religious mindset is everywhere and it's really hard to get rid of. And I'm not even sure if getting rid of it's a good idea. One of the ways that my mind has changed when it comes to religion is something that was sold is that religion is the problem. It's not. Sam Harris said this himself. It's not. Dogma is the problem. Dogma is the problem. Tribalism is the problem. And you will find this in any movement. Tribalism, dogma, they're the problems. Now, do they sit and nest very well in religions? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Religions treat it like a feature, not like a bug. But so too do other movements. And I think that when you're looking at some of the social justice elements of the fractures, the lines where atheism has went, and sometimes atheism didn't go there, but it was just there anyway, you do see the same tribalism and dogma. There's things that you cannot say, there's things that you cannot do. That person is a blasphemer, you must remove them from the premises. This is something that you do find in these movements, and I think that what you're referring to there is the people that recognize that the dogma is the problem. They tend to consistently go, I don't like it at all. And if it's going to happen in that community that's on my side, well, as Jordan Peterson would say, I'm going to clean my room. I'm going to have a go at it. And I'm someone that would absolutely agree with that. That's what you got to do. So yeah, I am very sympathetic to what you were expressing there.
I mean, I struggle to put you in either of these two camps that we've described here, Stephen, and maybe that's a good thing. Because you've kind of, at one level, I see you as very progressive and you're absolutely all about, sort of responding to homophobia, transphobia. I see you as, very, engaged with issues like feminism and so on, human rights. At the same time, you, as you've intimated, you kind of had your own experience of being, as it were, yes, cancelled for want of a better word, after you did sort of put your thoughts in on the transgender controversy. So just for the sake of those who don't, know what happened, would you just kind of describe for us what happened? Perhaps just give us a sort of sequential kind of story of what happened and what led to you gaining this reputation online as a transphobe, when as far as I can see you are anything but let's hear your account of this.
Of course. Something I'll say to what you just said about me being in between, by the way. I think that this is the bane of my existence. It's like when it comes to politics, I sit somewhat in the middle. So socially I'm very left, but economically I'm relatively conservative. This makes me a, quote, enlightened centrist, which means you're hated by both sides. When it comes to my diet, I'm a vegetarian, which means I'm hated by both sides. So if I have to be in the middle of new atheism and old atheism, or whatever it might be, hell, call me a medieval atheist. It looks like this is just the way it's meant to be for me. I'm sitting in that middle. Not out of choice, it's just where I land.
Yeah.
So on the trans thing then, so what I did is I made a video on trans athletics, and I did a pretty damn poor job of it. I didn't do my due diligence. I didn't think about, what kind of effect does HRT have on, say, a trans woman's body? Because it has a profound effect, but the video didn't even include that. So it was a really poor video. I messed up. However, because I am part of a niche, or I was part of a niche that very much was fighting for transgender people, obviously that's a problem. If you have someone on a platform, say the Atheist Experience, which is what I was on, and that platform is meant to be inclusive to trans people, and yet I've got a video that is really poor on any trans topic, such as trans athletics, that's a problem. And like, you're sending a mixed message to the people that are trying to find a space that's actually safe to them. So I entirely understand why it was a problem. Long story short, I ended up pulling the video off public, so it's unlisted. I don't like to delete my mistakes. I think it's okay to just go, look, I made a mistake. You can access it if you've got the link, but it's not public. I donated the ad revenue that it made to charity, and I remade the video going, look, here's a remake of the video. For some people that was good enough. For other people, it wasn't. And what I learned from this is that a lot of the people that were very, very angry at me know as little about athletics than my video knew about trans people. So I ended up effectively doing all right in the eyes of a lot of trans people. Trans people are incredibly understanding, especially for how much crap they have to deal with in life. But certain little epochs, certain little movements, no, they would have burnt me if they could. And they certainly tried to burn my career, and with relative success. So, I have been on the end of that, but I partly think that, I kind of deserved it. I didn't do my due diligence, but, it is what it is.
I mean, again, if you don't mind, for the sake of those who sort of weren't sort of aware of the kerfuffle at the time, you were invited, weren't you, out to be on the Atheist Experience, popular show in the US, at the time hosted by Matt Dillahunty. Just explain what happened there, because as far as I'm aware, the actual recording and everything went fine. It was sort of blew up afterwards. What can you remind me of the sort of timeline of events for that?
Yeah, so I went on the Atheist Experience, and we had a good show. And yes, trans stuff didn't come up at all. We just talked with a few theists. I think it was about evolution and whatnot. But then afterwards, a lot of complaints came into the ACA, the Atheist Community of Austin, saying, we're not happy that you platform Stephen Woodford because he's transphobic. And their evidence for me being transphobic is the video that I published, which, as I've said, it was a bad video. And I can totally see why someone would look at that and think that I am transphobic. Transphobic's a weird word, right? It's like, what does it mean? Well, it depends on the person you're talking to, but I think it's fair, like with a lot of the criticisms. So because they got that backlash, that's what caused the event to spark, really, and it went from there.
So you obviously, tried to put that right, record a better video, and so on. Just out of interest, where did you eventually land on the issue that, you were originally trying to investigate and come to a conclusion on it, as to whether there was an unfair advantage for transgender women in athletics?
It's hard to put this succinctly, but I'll give it a go. Since the 1950s, sociologists, philosophers, and biologists have been moving more and more to separating sex from gender. And the reason for that is for various discoveries. One such instance is complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. So I'm a male, which is to say, with the definitions I'm giving you here, and these are pretty popular, I have XY chromosomes and I have small gametes, sperm. That's what makes me a male. I've got testicles and I've got XY chromosomes. Most males, or vast majority of males, are going to fit that. However, if I had this condition, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, what would happen is that my body wouldn't process essentially the testosterone, the androgens. And the consequence is that I would present entirely to you as a woman. I would actually have a vagina, I'd have breasts, I would look completely female to you, and you wouldn't know any better unless I could tell you that I haven't had a period, for instance. You can look this condition up on YouTube, it's very fascinating, but it's just one instance of intersex. And these kind of discoveries made people realize, or made the people that most study these things, the sociologists, the biologists, the philosophers, okay, sex and gender are not the same thing. They can't be, because you wouldn't look at someone that completely and utterly presents as a female and you wouldn't even know that they're male. You can't just start calling them a dude and making them using the male's bathroom and making them fight with males in sports. Like, that's ludicrous. That's complete nonsense. So you had this movement of splitting sex and gender, and you can find it a lot in the literature with feminism in the 1970s. And so I very much buy that view. Can you remind me of your question? Because I know I needed to get that out.
Just where do you land eventually, I suppose, on this issue of the unfairness thing?
So because I buy that sex and gender are not one of the same thing, when it comes to sports, I think gender is completely irrelevant. Like, it shouldn't come up at all, gender. Not sex. Sex is important, or at least I should say secondary sex characteristics. That is to say, what testosterone does to the body. Because what it does is it makes you so that you're taller, it will make you broader, it will change the type of muscle fibers that you have, it will have a profound effect on you, it will make your plates fuse wider, and And if you have higher testosterone, you have more hemoglobin in your blood, it has dramatic effects. There's a reason why we ban steroids in sports. So really, what's happening in sports is you have an open category, which is essentially anyone can join. We've called it men in the past, but actually now institutions are changing it just to go an open category. And then you have protected categories. So one protected category you might have is based on age. That's perfectly fine. It's discrimination because that's what sports is. But you're discriminating on something to try and get at least the illusion of meaningful competition. And one of the protected categories we have is, historically, it's been known as the Women's League. I'd call it the female because I'd split sex and gender. And so when it comes to, say, any kind of physical sport, particularly with like boxing or anything like that, you're going to want to split it on secondary sex characteristics, which means you could call it female if you like, because typically that's how you would split it. Or you could break it down by talking about viralization of testosterone. You can use any term you like. It doesn't really matter. But the point is that gender, like whether or not that person's a man or a woman, doesn't matter. So my view is, on the surface, complicated, but really it's not that complicated. It's just, look, it's based on secondary sex characteristics. That's what you're separating sports on. And different sports are going to want different parameters, as they do. Like when you look at football, no one cares about how much you weigh in football because it's not something that's important to the sport. However, go to the UFC, it's incredibly important. The difference of like 2 or 3 kilos is going to make it so that the big guy is going to win almost every single time. So they make protected categories. Every league in the UFC is protected apart from the heavyweight, because if you had them all together, the heavyweight would just go in and win everything.
Yeah.
And so that's I hope I've been articulate enough in my position.
That helps. I mean, where does that leave you, I suppose? I mean, comparing to, does that make you broadly sympathetic with someone like Sharon Davies, who, is well known for her critique of the transgender sort of current, approach to transgender in athletics?
Yes. So when it comes to a lot of people complaining about the athletic state and having trans women in athletics, it's always trans women because, again, it's the women's league that's a protected category. This is why people are focusing on trans women and not trans men. When it comes to their critiques of like, look, this is unfair, or this is a violation of how sports has always been, etc., I am sympathetic to a lot of their views. However, almost all of them are transphobic, and they don't just like say, listen, let's base this on sex characteristics. No, they start saying really nasty and uninformed things, such as, he's a man in a dress. And it's just like, really? Like, no nuance here whatsoever? So for me, I get really frustrated. And as you were saying earlier about me being in the middle ground, well, I'm in the middle ground here, aren't I? I'm like, no, I recognise the problems. But man, like, this transphobia is just insane. It's absolutely insane at the moment.
And again, would you say the same of someone like J.K. Rowling, another sort of lightning rod of controversy, but someone who says that she's not transphobic? She says, I'm here to protect women's rights and, the hard-won sort of spaces and so on for women, and that. What's your view on that?
So I'm not as informed on J.K. to be able to give you a solid answer, but I will say that from everything I've heard of her, no, I just think that J.K. is frankly very ill-informed on this topic. And she says a lot of stuff that is transphobic. And I don't know why people are turning to her as if, like, she's a sociologist or a biologist or a philosopher. Like, there's not anything interesting being said in terms of content. It's just reaffirming the biases of other people. And then watch her speak about women's rights. Very important thing, okay? But, like, if you do separate sex from gender, you can still have your cake and eat it too. You can say, listen, we're really talking about female rights, so it's about females. If you wanted to do it that way, there's a few problems with that as well, but like nothing simple. What I'm tired of is people pretending that these complex topics are simple. They're not. And really, when I talk with someone and they pretend that these complex topics are simple, in my head, I just know that I'm probably dealing with an ideologue.
I mean, I don't know what you think of this, but I almost wonder sometimes whether transgender in particular has kind of almost reintroduced into the public sphere in a funny way the idea of a sort of the spiritual or the soul, because it appears to me that often someone who is experiencing, that they're a different gender from, their physical characteristics, their body, as it were, is saying there's something, I'm not merely my body. There's a me inside that needs to be expressed, and it feels almost like they're talking about something that is sort of mystical, spiritual. That gender is a sort of a slightly more mysterious entity than just the biology of. What do you think of that? Is there a kind of a space in the transgender sort of movement for that sort of spiritual relationship to your identity?
I think you can meet people, again, where they're at. So if I was talking to a Christian, and in my experience, sadly, most Christians are pretty nasty to trans people. But if I wanted to convince them, maybe you shouldn't be so confident in your denunciation of this, I would start speaking about the fact that that the flesh is weak, and that we're not perfect because of Adam and Eve. That we're not perfect because of the scripture, and that some things that you experience with your soul don't align with your bodily experience. Why would that be any different when it comes to some of us and actually our bodies? If it is the case that, the reason why you have this physical ailment, say the ailment is diabetes, you could cash that out in a theological sense of saying, yeah, the flesh is weak, and this is part of the evidence to show that, we're fallen. Likewise, you could say that, someone could be born in the wrong body, which is not to say that they were born in the wrong body necessarily. What you could say is that, the conditions made it so that androgen, didn't work in the way that it does with typical people, and it's resulted in the psyche being changed and the soul developing. Your soul develops as you go along. But for me, no, I wouldn't say that it's spiritual in that sense. What I would say is that gender is quite obviously a social construct. And what I mean by that is that I would define a woman, for instance, as someone who lives up to a social construct that heavily correlates with secondary sex characteristics, genitalia, aesthetics, and behaviours. And I think with that view, you can make much more sense of the differentiation over time in a culture, and indeed in different cultures, of what they see as a woman. It changes over time. It's like money. It's a social construct. The coins exist, but the value that we imbue in it is a collective that we all decide what it is. And whether or not that counts as it, you decide as a society as well. But there is ways that you could speak of it in a spiritual sense, but probably unsurprisingly, it's not one that I would go for.
There's more I'd be fascinated chasing this down with you a bit further, but perhaps it's for another day to talk about these issues. It's been really helpful to hear your perspective on them, though. Thank you very much for sharing. What do you, just as a sort of closing question, what do you think the future holds? Do you think we are basically headed, coming back to the atheist Christian thing, towards a broadly secular society? Do you think that's where the direction of travel is, or do you think religion will always sort of be part of, culture and that kind of thing?
I think that the religiosity, so not specifically Christianity, but just some form of religiosity, it's in our DNA. And what I mean by that is that we have a social software and we pick things up with intuition far before we understand them logically. You think of the Bible, or at least the Torah, it says don't eat pig. And it's like, well, why? Like, what's going on there? Well, one of the reasons is that you got to cook it right, and if you don't, you're going to die. Well, it's kind of, the people there would have figured that out intuitively and written it down. Like, on a secular frame, you've got a good understanding of why that came first. Brett Weinstein has coined the term metaphorical truth, and I think that's broadly how humans think. We're not very rational. Like, if anything I've learned from having a YouTube channel called Rationality Rules, you, me, and everyone else are not very rational. It's really difficult to understand the propositions that you believe, let alone know whether or not they're entailed by your other beliefs. Another instance that comes to mind is the miasma theory of disease. And that was the idea that you get disease because there's bad air. That's how you get cholera. That's how you get, malaria. It's wrong. It's just wrong. But it's right to a degree, in the sense that if you act as if it's true, you will survive longer. So if you act as if it's true and you don't go to the cities because they've got bad air, well, what's actually happening? You're not going to be in the presence of people that are ill, and so you're not going to catch it. I think that this mode of being, this disposition that we have, is something that will only leave us if we alter our genes. So in that sense, I think that the internal religious wiring that we have is not going anywhere, and it hasn't gone anywhere. If you want to see, as is depicted on your book, that tide come back on in, I think it's going to be due to very economic and, say, information-based reasons. So we know that religiosity goes up when there's a war. It could be because people reflect more and think of God. It could be because people are scared. There's many reasons for it. We know that religiosity goes up when there's a lack of information. Whatever reasons, we can go into it, as we did on my podcast. But I think that no, the religious bone in most people's bodies, but not mine, is not going anywhere. Not unless you change it with DNA.
Well, look, thank you so much for talking about, as religiously as you can, about the bones in your body. Stephen, it's been really fun just to spend some time chatting these issues through with you. Thank you so much. And for anyone watching the full interview here between myself and Stephen, do go and check the links to check out Stephen's channel and more of his resources. But for now, thank you very much for joining me.
Always a pleasure, Justin. Thank you for everything that you do.
Stephen is clearly on a journey, even though he's still quite firmly an atheist. Yet there are many others who are being drawn out of atheism into belief in God, even specifically into Christianity. One such person is French former anti-theist Guillaume Bignon.
I heard myself thinking, this is ridiculous, I need to figure this out.
Check out his journey in this video next. And you can visit justinbrierley.com for signed copies of my books, a free chapter with the newsletter, and to support my work through Patreon or US tax-deductible giving. Supporters can get free signed copies, early access, bonus content, and monthly catch-up calls with me. That's justinbrierley.com.